The courtroom was already filling by the time Karoline Leavitt walked in, file folder in hand, heels clicking softly on the marble floor. It was a federal building, tall ceilings, solemn architecture, the kind of place that echoed not just sound, but authority. Karoline looked young, too young, many would say, to be litigating a constitutional challenge against a major municipality, and as she made her way to her seat at the plaintiff's table, she could feel the glances, some curious, others doubtful. Asterisk across the aisle. The opposing counsel, a grizzled man named Leonard Granger, barely glanced at her before turning back. To his notes, he had litigated for over 30 years, often in front of the same judge who would preside today. To him, Karoline was likely just another overconfident junior attorney with something to prove. In his mind, she'd crack before the hearing was even halfway through. Asterisk, but it was the man seated on the bench, Judge Wallace, who made the atmosphere shift. Known for his sharp tongue and sharper memory, he had a reputation for putting young lawyers in their place. Not cruelly, necessarily, but firmly. Old school, no nonsense. The kind who believed real legal ability came with gray hair and trial scars. Asterisk, when the clerk called the case, Judge Wallace shuffled his papers and finally looked up. His eyes paused on Karoline for just a beat too long. Not because she had done anything wrong, just because she didn't fit the mold. She was young, unapologetically so. No trembling hands, no nervous posture, but young all the same. Asterisk, Ms. Leavitt, Wallace began, his voice steady but tinged with something that wasn't quite sarcasm, maybe skepticism. You'll be arguing for the plaintiff today. Asterisk, Karoline stood, nodded politely. Yes, Your Honor. Asterisk, he raised an eyebrow and half smiled. Well, we'll see if you can keep up with Mr. Granger. He's been trying cases longer than you've likely been alive. Asterisk, a few chuckles broke out in the courtroom, mostly from the back benches, where local attorneys and law clerks often came to observe. Karoline didn't laugh, she didn't react, she just nodded again, and replied, I look forward to the discussion, Your Honor. Asterisk, Wallace leaned back in his chair and gave a nod of his own, but his expression said everything. He wasn't expecting much. To him, this young woman wasn't a threat or a contender. She was a curiosity, at best. Maybe she'd deliver a few well-rehearsed lines, stumble under pressure, and get politely dismissed. That was how it usually went. Asterisk, it wasn't the first time Karoline had seen that looked out wrapped in politeness. She'd seen it during media briefings, town hall events, even in law school mock trials. People assumed that if you were composed and articulate and young, it had to be They didn't expect depth beneath the surface. And in a courtroom, that assumption could be even more entrenched. There were unwritten rules about age, appearance, even tone that dictated who was taken seriously. Asterisk, as she began to lay out the facts of the case, Judge Wallace listened, but his posture still said he was humoring her. He watched her like a teacher watches a student on the first day of class, curious to see if the student really belongs at the desk or just wandered in by accident. Asterisk, Karoline's voice didn't waver. She didn't rush or oversell. Instead, she moved carefully through her opening statements, citing legal precedent with surgical precision. But even then, she could feel the judge's tone when he interrupted with procedural questions. They were fair questions, but there was a subtle edge to them, like he was testing her more than he would test someone else. Asterisk, he did it again when she cited a case related to viewpoint discrimination. Ms. Leavitt, he said, tapping a finger on the bench. Are you sure that case is applicable here? The facts seem rather dissimilar. Asterisk, Karoline met his eyes. Calm. Respectfully, Your Honor, the core holding applies directly. The court in that case addressed not the specific facts, but the principle of content neutrality, which is at the heart of today's issue. Asterisk, Wallace paused, lips tightening. He didn't object outright, but he still didn't look convinced. Not yet. Asterisk, Karoline knew this stance, knew how easily a courtroom could become a proving ground, not just for your arguments, but for your legitimacy. And today, it was clear from the first moment, the judge didn't just doubt her case. He doubted her. Asterisk, Karoline didn't take the bait. Asterisk, as the hearing moved forward, the judge's tone remained dry, measured, but there was something just beneath the surface that carried an almost performative edge. He wasn't outright dismissive, but he tested her in a way that was hard to ignore. Subtle pauses after her statements, mild interruptions couched as clarifications, and rhetorical questions that, to anyone watching closely, felt more like intellectual jabs than genuine queries. Asterisk, it wasn't hostility. Judge Wallace was too seasoned for that. He knew how to couch skepticism in the language of protocol, but Karoline could sense it with every shift in his voice. He was prodding her, pushing, waiting for her to stumble or hesitate. For many, that pressure might have registered as intimidation, but Karoline didn't waver. Asterisk, she kept her shoulders square and her voice clear, not just for the judge's benefit, but for the integrity of the argument she came to deliver. She'd prepared not just for the legal challenge, but for this exact dynamic, because she knew, walking into that courtroom, that appearances would speak louder than briefs, at least at first. Asterisk, when she cited Reed v. Town of Gilbert again to anchor her central point. Judge Wallace leaned forward with a slight smirk. Counselor, I'm quite familiar with the ruling, he said, but I fail to see how this ordinance rises to the level of content-based restriction in the same sense. That seems like a generous interpretation. Karoline took a beat. Not long enough to appear uncertain, just long enough to show she was thinking, not reacting. Understood, Your Honor, she replied calmly, flipping a tab in her binder. But if I may, Section 3 of the ordinance distinguishes between flags permitted on public-facing property by message. Military commemorative flags are not listed among the approved categories, while seasonal, municipal, and sports flags are. That's not just administrative oversight. It's a line drawn around content. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to feel like a shift in the room. Wallace blinked. Continue. He wasn't laughing now. He wasn't smiling either, but something in his posture changed. Slightly more attentive. A touch more focused. Karoline continued with poise. She didn't rush the moment. Didn't spike the football. She had learned that grace under pressure often speaks louder than performance, especially in court. Especially with someone like Judge Wallace, who'd seen every variety of courtroom ego and bravado over the decades. What he hadn't seen, at least not often, was someone this composed, this young, who responded not with defiance or anxiety, but with measured, professional. And that composure held. Even when Granger, her opposing counsel, tried to press her, during a cross-argument exchange. Granger raised his voice slightly. Your Honor, the plaintiff is stretching the boundaries of precedent here. There's no evidence that enforcement of the ordinance was carried out with discriminatory intent. Karoline didn't flinch. She turned to the judge without raising her tone. Your Honor, she said smoothly, intent is not the bar. The Supreme Court has held that even well-meaning laws are unconstitutional if they result in discriminatory application. And in McCullen v. Coakley it was established that motive does not sanitize impact. Judge Wallace narrowed his eyes, slightly, then looked down at the printouts in front of him. She had his attention now. Not because she'd overpowered the argument, but because she hadn't let the courtroom's undercurrents disrupt her rhythm. Through every exchange, Karoline remained steady. No nervous tics, no searching for the right words. She had the case law, she had the data, and more importantly, she had control over her own presence, where most attorneys her age might have let the pressure show. She did something rarer. She let it pass right through her. Wallace asked a few more questions. Some pointed, some open-ended. He was still testing, but less aggressively now. Less like he was doubting her credibility, and more like he was genuinely trying to understand how far her argument extended. There was a noticeable difference. Karoline didn't change pace. She answered each one directly, concisely, without filler or theatrics. She knew the law. She trusted it. More than that, she trusted herself with it. Even as the judge's tone softened, she didn't let her own shift in response. She stayed anchored in her approach, respectful, controlled, and professional. Because the goal wasn't to win him over with charm or cleverness. It was to demonstrate that she belonged there, not through argument alone, but through restraint, through quiet authority. Karoline knew this case couldn't be won on passion or personality alone. It would live or die on the strength of the legal foundation beneath it, and that's where she had placed her focus for months. She had spent late nights poring through precedents, dissecting city ordinances, and analyzing patterns of enforcement that many would have overlooked. By the time she stepped into Judge Wallace's courtroom, she knew the facts of the case better than anyone, including, she suspected, the attorneys representing the city. As the hearing progressed, her preparation became undeniable. After Karoline finished her core argument about the ordinance being a content-based restriction, Judge Wallace paused, his brow furrowed. He leaned over his desk and thumbed through the printed ordinance. Miss Leavitt, he said, you mentioned a selective pattern of enforcement. That's a strong claim. Do you have documentation supporting it? Without missing a beat, Karoline stepped forward and handed the clerk a neatly organized binder, color-coded and indexed. Yes, Your Honor. Tab C contains affidavits from 4 residents who are cited under the ordinance. Tab D includes photographic evidence taken within a 48-hour period showing other residences with unapproved banners that were not cited. In Tab E, Wallace held up a hand as he flipped to the pages she referenced. The courtroom was silent as he scanned them. The pictures were clear. One house had a thin blue line. Flags cited. Another, a Veterans for Freedom banner, also cited. Meanwhile, holiday-themed flags, sports team banners, and novelty signs remained untouched, displayed in full view, often on the same block. Karoline didn't speak. She let the silence do its work. Her job was already done. Judge Wallace shifted. In his seat, he read part of one affidavit aloud, then glanced at her again. All of these individuals received citations within the last 6 months. Yes, Your Honor. All for displaying banners that expressed political or military-related viewpoints. Wallace looked back at the city attorney. Mr. Granger. Granger stood and stammered slightly. Your Honor, the enforcement officers have broad discretion. It's a practical matter. There's no way to police every sign or flag in the city. Karoline didn't interrupt, but she was ready. When it was her turn to respond, she kept her voice steady. Discretion is not a defense for discrimination, Your Honor, and while enforcement doesn't have to be perfect, it cannot be systematically biased toward specific viewpoints. The city's own citation records, which I included in Tab F, that over 70% of the issued citations targeted displays with either political or military messaging. That's not random. Asterisk. Judge Wallace didn't argue. He didn't push back. He just turned another page, quietly reading. Asterisk. The shift in the room was almost imperceptible, but it was real. The judge, who had begun the hearing with a thinly veiled skepticism about Karoline's competence, was now reading her exhibits with genuine focus. She had anticipated the counter-arguments, laid out the evidence with care, and dismantled the city's case without raising her voice or making it personal. Asterisk. When the city's council later attempted to challenge her interpretation of Reed v. Town of Gilbert, Karoline calmly referenced a subsequent appellate decision that had clarified its application to signage and flags. She had footnotes in her materials pointing to that case as well. Every argument she made led directly to a source, no speculation, no gray areas. Judge Wallace looked up from his notes and gave a small nod almost to himself. Ms. Leavitt, he said, in your view, is there a narrowly tailored version of this ordinance that would survive constitutional scrutiny? Asterisk. It was a serious question. One judge is usually reserved for attorneys they view as credible, capable of contributing to the actual shaping of the law. Asterisk. Karoline answered without delay. Yes, Your Honor. A content-neutral policy that regulates flag size, placement, and number uniformly across all categories, without exception based on message, could address safety concerns without violating the First Amendment. Asterisk. Wallace didn't say anything for a moment. Then, he glanced at the city's attorney and said, that would have been a better place to start. Asterisk. Her preparation had turned the tide. She hadn't relied on emotion or courtroom flair. She had built a fortress of logic, case law, and hard evidence, one that even a seasoned judge like Wallace couldn't dismiss. What began as an uphill battle against perception had become a clear demonstration of competence that no one in the room could ignore. The mood in the courtroom had changed by the final hour of the hearing. What had started as a subtle tension, a young attorney presenting before a judge known for his strict standards, had shifted into something far more compelling. The spectators sensed it too. Legal interns who had initially snuck glances at Karoline out of curiosity were now watching her with full attention, and Judge Wallace, who had earlier treated her with restrained condescension, was no longer questioning her credibility. He was openly engaging with her reasoning. Asterisk. As Karoline moved into her closing argument, she didn't alter her tone or ramp up her delivery. She didn't need to. Her power was in the restraint, the calm steadiness that made her case feel inevitable. She summarized the central point. With surgical clarity, the ordinance in question was not neutral, not uniformly applied, and not legally sustainable under precedents set by the Supreme Court. Asterisk. Judge Wallace leaned forward slightly, one hand pressed to his temple, fingers tapping rhythmically as she spoke. He'd seen hundreds of closing arguments in his career, many delivered by attorneys with decades more experience. But there was something about the way she wove constitutional doctrine, real-world evidence, and measured analysis into one seamless thread that clearly held his attention. Asterisk. When she concluded, she didn't dramatize the moment. She simply stepped back, returned to her seat, and folded her hands quietly. No smile, no self-satisfaction, just readiness. Asterisk. Judge Wallace adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. For the first time that day, his voice carried no hint of skepticism or superiority. Thank you, Ms. Leavitt, he said plainly, his tone even almost respectful. Asterisk. That thank you, coming from him, was significant. Asterisk. There was a brief recess before closing remarks from the city. As people quietly stood and stretched, Wallace remained at his bench, flipping back through Karoline's exhibits and notes. At one point, he even underlined something in her submission, a small but telling gesture. Asterisk. When the hearing resumed, the city's closing remarks felt oddly flat in comparison. Granger repeated several earlier points, insisting the ordinance was not enforced with discriminatory intent, but the argument lacked energy. Wallace stopped him at one point to clarify a detail. About citation procedures, a detail Karoline had already clarified in her earlier testimony. Granger fumbled for the correct tab in his binder while the judge looked on, unimpressed. Asterisk. It was clear the balance had shifted. Asterisk. When the hearing finally concluded, and the judge announced he would take the matter under advisement, everyone in the courtroom stood. The gavel sounded, signaling the end of proceedings. But even as the room began to clear, Wallace remained seated, thumbing through Karoline's binder one more time. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke up. Ms. Leavitt, he said. Karoline paused, halfway to packing up her notes. Yes, Your Honor. Asterisk. He looked at her over the top of his glasses. Out of curiosity, where did you clerk before entering practice? Asterisk. Karoline straightened. I clerked for Judge Harrington on the Second Circuit, Your Honor. Asterisk Wallace gave a small, knowing nod. That makes sense. Asterisk there was a silence that followed, not awkward, but waited. It was as though he'd decided, in that moment, to acknowledge her not just as a capable litigator, but as a peer in the profession. Asterisk that simple exchange, the way he asked, the way he responded, spoke volumes. From a judge like Wallace, who was known for his no-nonsense demeanor and reluctance to hand out praise, it was a rare and meaningful moment. It was not a compliment for show. It was a genuine mark of recognition. Asterisk Karoline offered a brief, professional smile. Thank you, Your Honor. He didn't say more, and she didn't need him to. As she left the courtroom, several observers whispered to one another about how she had handled herself. One clerk turned to another and said quietly, "He actually listened to her." That almost never happens with first-time litigators in his court. Asterisk it was true. Judge Wallace had come in expecting to offer a lesson. Instead, he had watched a lesson unfold in front of him, not just in legal precision, but in professional poise. Karoline hadn't needed to argue for her own credibility. She had simply made it impossible to question. Asterisk. As Karoline stepped out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon light, she didn't rush. She moved with the same steady composure that had carried her through the entire hearing. Her binder was tucked neatly under one arm, her expression unreadable, but those who had watched her knew they had just witnessed something quietly remarkable. Asterisk she hadn't come to prove a point about herself. She had come to defend a constitutional principle. Yet in doing so, she had managed to challenge more than just a city ordinance. She had challenged an expectation and assumption shared by many in that courtroom, perhaps even by Judge Wallace himself. Asterisk he had expected competence, maybe, but not clarity like hers. Not research that deep, not logic that airtight, and certainly not such unshakable control from someone so new to the courtroom floor. But she had brought it all without ego, without performance. She hadn't needed to overpower the judge. She'd simply outworked the doubt. Asterisk Wallace, a man not known for warmth or flattery, had ended the day recognizing her not only as someone with potential but as someone already worthy of the court's respect. That shift didn't come through a single dramatic moment. It had built slowly, almost invisibly, through every citation, every counterpoint under pressure. Asterisk for Karoline, this wasn't just about winning one case. It was about what the moment represented. That courtroom, with all its traditions and protocols, had been the ultimate arena for testing her preparation, her restraint, her ability to stand on principle without needing to stand on a pedestal. Asterisk she had walked in viewed as a curiosity, a young woman with little courtroom experience, facing a sharp and skeptical judge. But she had walked out having earned something rare and unspoken, silent, authentic respect. Asterisk and for Judge Wallace, who had started the day with a quiet chuckle at her expense. It's likely he'll remember that hearing long after the ruling is issued, not just because of the legal arguments, though those were impressive on their own, but because of the way she carried them. Asterisk in a world where noise often outweighs nuance, Karoline Leavitt had chosen a different route. She didn't raise her voice, she raised the standard, and in doing so, she didn't just win the room, she changed